Hello everyone and welcome to this, another Thomas and Friends related video where I will be continuing my top 5 series, and today we'll be going through series 2. Now we've already covered series 1, so I'm going to really enjoy doing this top 5 as series 2 probably is actually my favourite series. But anyway, don't forget, as a little reminder, if you haven't become a Patreon of the channel, please do and become part of the Twin Hat channel. So Series 2 was aired in September of 1986, which was the same year I was actually born. And like Series 1, majority of the episodes were adaptations of Wilbert's books. Series 2 is absolutely fantastic, so I'm having a hard time picking my top 5. I will do some honourable mentions, of course. But here is my top 5 Thomas and Friends Series 2 episodes, and let's begin with number 5. So at number 5 is Percy and the Signal. This is probably not one of the best stories in terms of character development or even plot, like something like Thomas Comes to Breakfast or Ghost Train or Edward's Exploit, but I do really enjoy this one. I have very fond memories of watching this story as a kid. The story unfolds that Percy decides to play tricks on the big engines. Especially James, as he actually convinces him to just stay in the shed and wait until the Fat Controller decides to see him. James does exactly this, and actually, kudos to Percy, he has managed to con James and the big engines to do James's work as well as their own work and keep James stuck in the shed. That is pretty good trickery from Percy. Anyway, a few days later, the inspector comes and informs James that he needs to get his big red tender into gear and start moving. James says he won't do that until the Fat Controller comes to see him, to which the inspector informs him that the Fat Controller has actually in fact been away from the island for quite a while. Oh! Later on, Gordon and James hatch a plan to get Percy back. They start talking about backing signals, and they convince Percy that this is actually a thing, when in fact it is not. It's a complete fabrication. Percy then later pulls a train of trucks and sidles up to a signal. When the signal is raised, Percy assumes, not seeing this sort of signal before, decides that this must be a backing signal. Of course it's not. He then backs up to his driver's absolute bewilderment, "Stop!" and encourages him to go forwards, as he should. Percy then realises that he has been tricked, and before he can even move off again, Gordon passes with the express and has seen it all. Oh, he got burned by Gordon there. And I do like these tit-for-tat sort of stories. It's a great little story, one of my absolute favourites that I could watch again and again. That's number 5. What could possibly be at number 4? At number 4, we have Old Iron. It's a really good redemption story, especially for Edward. So the story begins, James is waiting at the station, Edward is late, and James starts criticising that Edward is slow and out of date, until the next day where James's driver is ill and is relieved of duty. Whilst James's fireman is getting James ready for shunting, 2 boys jump onto James's footplate, mess around with his controls, and James is off. He's off. He's not hanging around. What is it about boys in the early series of Thomas and Friends? Were they never at school? They're either throwing rocks and stones at Henry, or they're fiddling about with James's controls. Very unsafe indeed. Then the fireman goes to speak to the signalman, and the inspector informs them that he will be arriving on Edward to intercept the runaway train. Meanwhile, James is happily running down the line, and then suddenly he realises that he's out of control and there is no one there to slow him down and bring him to a stop. Whilst Edward is gallantly chasing after James, trying to save the day. Can he catch up to him? Can he? Yes, he can. And the inspector climbs onto Edward's footplate, wraps a rope around James's buffer, pulls it tight, and slows the train down as the fireman clambers over into James's cab. And Edward has saved the day. It's a slightly high-octane, very exciting little episode, especially when Edward is in pursuit. You just don't know. Is he going to catch up to James? Is James going to crash before Edward gets there? But Edward is an old reliable engine, and he saves the day and is very justly rewarded by the Fat Controller, being told that he will get his old parts mended And of course, James, once again, like he did with Toby in Dirty Object, is humbled by Edward, another very old and wise engine, and maybe James should take some solace in this. Does he? Of course he doesn't. He's James. He's never going to change. Silly engine. So that is number 4, Old Iron. Absolutely loved this one. I remember as a kid, it was so exciting watching Edward, who was obviously old and rickety, trying his absolute best, puffing his hardest, trying to catch up to James. And when he succeeded, it was so a triumphant moment. So here will be my number 3. So at number 3, it is actually a trilogy. And if you have seen Series 2, I think you know which trilogy I'm talking about. It is absolutely brilliant, and I can't split them into individual episodes and place them individually because they would take up over half the list. So I've kind of combined them into one long story arc episode because that's essentially what it is. And that is, of course, the Duck and Diesel trilogy. Duck is one of my favourite characters, and it is an absolutely brilliant story arc, and it was one of the best books from the Railway series as well, and they really did manage to recreate this for television and make it just as interesting, just as exciting as it is depicted in the books. And so we begin with the first part of this trilogy, Pop Goes the Diesel. And of course this is the arrival of the first Diesel on the island of Sodor, aptly named Diesel. And he's very snide and very greasy, oily, and a very suspect character. Very vain as well, very arrogant. Although he is very flattering towards the big engines and they are completely taken in by his facade, Duck is not as easily fooled. And Diesel almost admits to Duck that diesels are going to take over the railway and steam engines like him are surplus to requirements. Duck, of course, does not like this and immediately hatches a plan to get Diesel back. And whilst Duck is fetching Gordon's coaches, he asks Diesel to shunt a load of trucks for him. Of course, he completely throws a curveball and ends up directing Diesel to a group of trucks that are old and the brakes are on and they're not functioning very well. They're basically ready to fall apart. And Diesel toys with these trucks. He's trying to coax the trucks into moving. They're not interested. They don't want to be moved. They've been there for a long time. And Diesel pushes and pulls until basically he derails them, and then Duck sidles up alongside with his train of trucks and informs Diesel they were not the trucks he wanted in the first place. Diesel is fuming. And although it is not common knowledge, it's kind of implied that he is going to get his own back on Duck, which he does in the next episode, Dirty Work. Diesel basically starts a rumour that Duck has been saying nasty things about the engines, particularly Gordon, Henry and James. Gordon and Henry and James, for some reason completely taken in by Diesel's trickery and his facade, believe him over a steam engine like Duck. Now, Duck and Diesel are very similar in characters if you think about it. They're both quite proud of themselves. They both think they run the railway. They're both quite devious in a lot of ways, and they both manipulate the big engines for their own advantage. Duck does this in Duck Takes Charge, where he blocks the big engines from entering the sheds, and Diesel's doing it by spreading these rumours in order to turn the big engines against Duck. But because Duck is a steam engine, and we all love steam engines, don't we? We're gonna root for Duck. But really, there's not much to separate the two in terms of moral compass. Anyway, the engines then decide to block Duck from entering the sheds, the complete reversal of what happened in Duck Takes Charge. And they inform Duck that you've been telling lies about us and calling us names, one of them being a galloping sausage. But I would say it's more humorous than insulting. But anyway, I digress. Essentially, the Fat Controller comes to see what all the noise is about. The engines stick up for Diesel. The Fat Controller decides that he wants to remove Duck until he can sort out exactly what's going on here. So he very kindly asks Duck to go to Edward's station and help him for a while. And now we come to a close shave, the finale of the story arc trilogy. Duck starts helping Edward on the railway, rather disheartened that nobody believes him, and Edward reassures him that he believes that he is a very honest and noble engine and very hard-working, and they set about working together, pulling trucks up and down Edward's line. And as Duck is heading down Gordon's Hill after a long hard day of pushing and pulling trucks, suddenly there is a runaway.
Chase him, bump him, throw him off the rails.
The trucks have escaped and are in hot pursuit of Duck. And I tell you what, definitely probably the highlight of the trilogy, watching the trucks chasing Duck. And of course, it's very exciting. As a young kid, it's incredibly exciting. Again, it does a little bit like what the Flying Kipper does. It starts off very ominous and you don't really know what's going on. It just looks like two friends having a nice time, helping each other out, and you're just enjoying the ride, much like you do at the beginning of Flying Kipper. But you know something's going to go wrong, something's going to happen, and this is it. The trucks are in hot pursuit of Duck and are pretty much touching bumper to bumper as Duck sails into Edward's station. And luckily, Duck is diverted just in time to avoid crashing into the back of James. But that is not the end of it. At the end of the siding where Duck has been diverted, there is a barber shop at the end of the line. Nothing could possibly go wrong here. Duck goes headfirst straight into the barber shop. The barber, completely infuriated by this silly engine who's decided to just crash into his barber shop at random, decides to lather Duck's face in shaving foam, and hence the name A Close Shave. And soon the Fat Controller arrives. Thomas is helping to clear the wreckage, and the Fat Controller actually informs the barber Duck was actually incredibly brave and actually prevented a very serious accident. The barber completely apologizes, washes off the shaving foam off of Duck's face, and the Fat Controller announces that Diesel was a liar, he's been found out, and he has been removed from the island, and Duck is welcomed back by everybody. The big engines want him back, all is forgiven, and Duck is the hero of the day. And it's such a lovely ending and has cemented himself as one of the Fat Controller's engines. It is a terrific story arc. It sets it up in the first episode. You get to understand the characters and their motives. In the middle, you get to see the real devious dark side of Diesel. And in the third episode, you see that good will prevail. It's a good moral story, which again is what was great about Thomas, especially in the early days. It had a moral message, but it didn't push it in your face. It was subtle and it was entertaining, and that's the most important thing. Never dull, always entertaining. And that is at my number 3. So what could possibly be at number 2? At number 2, we have a Christopher Awdry story. So they did put some Christopher Awdry original stories from the Railway series and adapted them for television. And my favourite, and my second favourite episode of Series 2 is The Runaway. This is a brilliant story. This shows that you can have a very small cast of characters, you can have no crashes whatsoever, and you can have a really good story. From the very beginning, you're gripped. It starts off like this.
Thomas the tank engine was ill.
This is a very new experience for audiences, seeing Thomas seriously unwell and throwing Duck into the mix as well so early on into his introduction, and Edward, the oldest engine on Sodor, taking Thomas away. It's quite morbid and actually quite dark in a sense. And what's great about this story is that although it's a Christopher Awdry story, it moulds beautifully into Series 2 because this is the Duck introduction series, and Duck is thrown into this episode where he looks after Annie and Clarabelle. And then Thomas returns and he is fit and well again. But when he returns, it's quite clear that there are a few problems.
The works had left Thomas's handbrake very stiff.
Anyway, later on, he decides to stop at the station to wait for Henry's train. And it is discovered that the brakes have not been set correctly. And Thomas starts to move. Again, a little bit like James, no driver, no fireman aboard. Thomas is off and the runaway begins. Thomas is screeching down the line at full pace with Annie and Clarabelle in all sorts of hysterics.
Stop! Stop!
And a message goes out down the line to stop the runaway, and enter Harold the helicopter. Now, this is what's brilliant about the placement of the runaway, because we've just been introduced to Harold in Percy and Harold, and yet this is, like I said, a Christopher Awdry original story, and it's placed just after Percy and Harold, so it's beautifully synced together. It's so perfectly constructed, this series. Anyway, Thomas is starting to tire, and Harold the helicopter is in pursuit of the Runaway engine. And there's a real sense of dread and there's a sense of alarm when you're watching this, because again, are we going to have a moment like in A Close Shave? Thomas has only just come back from the works. We see him approaching the station and suddenly Harold lands. And again, the inspector, like in Old Iron, takes evasive action. Thomas then is stopped safely and securely. Everybody is pleased that Thomas has ground to a halt and is safe. But it's one of those stories that it's the intensity of what could happen that really elevates this story. And Ringo Starr's narration is one of the best for me. Even when I hear it now, it sends chills. I get goosebumps hearing it. The music, the atmosphere, the story itself, the narration, what's going on within the story. I just absolutely love it. It might not be the greatest episode of the series overall, but I absolutely love it. I have such fond memories. But that is my number 2. And now for my number 1 favourite episode of Series 2. Can anybody guess what it might be? But before I do, let me give you some very, very honourable mentions. Now, there could be about 3, 4, 5 episodes in this list that didn't make it, and only by an absolute fraction. One honourable mention is Brake Van. Again, a really good story. The brake van is causing problems within the yard, and Donald and Douglas are trying to find their way on the Fat Controllers Railway, and disasters all over the place. Unfortunately, it just misses out because it just doesn't encapsulate everything that makes it a top 5 story for me personally. But Brake Van, again, one of those that just sits outside the top 5. Another one is Thomas Comes to Breakfast. Of course, that is one of the classics of the series. It was just not one that I could quite justify making into the top 5. Although it has a lot of fond memories for me. It is a great story and it's an absolute classic. But it just again missed outside the top 5. And the other honourable mention is Duck Takes Charge. A really great story. It's the introduction of Duck, of course, one of my favourite characters. Conflict between Percy, Duck and the big engines is absolutely brilliant, and it definitely deserves a honourable mention, and all these would definitely be in my top 10. But now let's go back to the list itself and find out what has made number 1. Have you guessed it yet? Yes, at number 1, it is Percy Takes the Plunge. This, along with The Flying Kipper, is one of my all-time favourite Thomas stories, let alone my favourite story from Series 2. No other story comes close to this one. I absolutely love it. From start to finish, Percy again is talking to 2 engines who later are revealed as Bill and Ben. Now, this has a bit of context, this story, because the events that Percy is talking about to Bill and Ben, who of course we don't know are Bill and Ben until later on in the series, he's talking about water swirling under his boiler. He wasn't able to move, but he struggled on in order to get Thomas's passengers at their destination. And the story that Percy is telling is Percy's Promise, which of course never featured in that series. It featured in Series 3. And it doesn't ruin the enjoyment of the story whatsoever. It just gives us a bit more context of what Percy's talking about. But anyway, I digress once again. Henry then shoos the little engines away and criticising his boastfulness. Then Percy, as usual, can't help himself and teases Henry about the time that Henry was so afraid of rain that he ended up getting stuck in a tunnel. Later, Percy arrives at the quay where Thomas is looking at a danger board. Now, Thomas has had very bad experiences in the past with danger boards, if you remember the episode Down the Mine. And he warns Percy of this and says that he mustn't pass a danger sign because it means falling down something. Of course, Percy, after his experiences in the episode that would have been Percy's Promise, then ridiculing Henry and making him feel totally inadequate, has given Percy a new air of confidence. So he then decides to bargain with the troublesome trucks. Fatal mistake! Percy is pulling a train of trucks, and Percy asks the trucks if they would oblige him by pushing him just past the danger board, and Percy will stop just in time. And of course, we had been informed in the earlier part of the episode, the quay has sunk and the rails have sunk into the sea. But Percy doesn't think about this. Of course, he doesn't see the danger ahead and the fact that he's trying to bargain with the troublesome trucks. Does he not know the troublesome trucks? You know it's never going to end well. And it is at this point where Percy's conversing with the trucks that, again, like in the Flying Kipper, you're starting to put the pieces together and you're realizing that this isn't going to end very well. This isn't going to end with Percy proving a point. This is going to end in disaster, but you don't know exactly when and what is going to happen. You've got an inkling because we've set up the scene, but still, it's the anticipation. It just really grips you. Percy enters the key and he stops, hoping that the trucks will just push him enough past the board that he can stop himself in time. But of course, it all goes literally downhill from here.
"Oh!" said Percy, sliding past the board. Percy was frantic. "That's enough!"
Percy ends up in the sea. Oh dear, oh dear. And to make it even worse, the Fat Controller is there. He absolutely berates Percy and makes him feel like a complete silly engine. Percy is then rescued out of the key, and if you notice, there's a little Easter egg in there. Diesel is in the background whilst Percy is being pulled out of the sea. Diesel hasn't even been introduced at this point. Have a look. And then towards the end of the episode, Percy is on a breakdown truck and is being ready to be escorted away by none other than Henry. Henry then gets his chance to completely humiliate Percy. He escorts Percy out of the yards, and that is the end of the episode. What an episode. It is brilliant. It's got everything. It's got accidents. It's got good characters. It's got moral messages. It's got great story build-up. It's got intensity. It's got troublesome trucks. It's got Percy, one of the best characters of the series. And of course it has a crash, which is always awesome to watch in Thomas and Friends. It's what we watch it for. When we were growing up, that's what we were looking for. We loved it. And there's no better example than Percy Takes the Plunge. Again, this is another one where you get the goosebumps. It's just a brilliant episode. I absolutely love this one. And will forever always be not only one of my favourite episodes of all time, but absolutely my favourite Series 2 episode. It's just got everything, just like the Flying Kipper. Henry's involved again. There's a lot of great stories that involve Henry. But anyway, that is my number one. Percy Takes the Plunge. And that is it. That is my top 5 for Series 2. It's been a long time coming, this video. I do apologise, but I have got round to it now. And the next one, of course, will be discussing my top 5 Series 3 episode. I hope you've enjoyed this video. And I say again, if you haven't become a Patreon of the channel, please do. All your support is very, very much appreciated. And I will see you folks on the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.